Today's Take 5 with the Saints, March the 28th, profiles James Solomon Russell, an African-American priest who became one of the great leaders of the Episcopal Church, and not just among African Americans, in what is now known today as the Diocese of Southern Virginia, working for over 50 years to advance both the place of African Americans within the church and the growth of the Diocese of Southern Virginia in general. And his work helped to spur a diocese which remains today one of the dioceses which has the largest percentage of African American participants in the Episcopal Church to this day. Our scripture that goes with his feast day today comes out of John chapter 14, verses 8 through 14. Philip said to Jesus, "Lord, show us the Father, and we will be satisfied." Jesus said to him, "Have I been with you all this time, Philip, and you still do not know me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you I do not speak on my own, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. But if you do not, then believe me because of the works themselves. Very truly I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and in fact will do greater works than these, because I am going to the Father. I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If in my name you ask me for anything, I will do it." James Solomon Russell was born in 1857, so just prior to the Civil War, and as such was born as a slave to a household of slaves in Mecklenburg County, Virginia, which is situated right on the North Carolina line. He was, of course, freed with his family after the conclusion of the Civil War. From a very young age, though, his mother recognized that there was something in this boy that would lead him to become a leader of the church in some way, shape, or form. He was exposed as a young age to the Episcopal Church, part of which was attending what is now known as Hampton University, was known as Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in the day, where he was exposed to a great deal of Episcopalians, and from that he was able to move on and attend theological college, and ultimately was ordained a priest ordained a deacon, in 1882, and ultimately as a priest in 1887. In 1882, right when he was ordained a deacon, he married his wife, Virginia Michigan Morgan, from Petersburg, Virginia, which became a place that was highly important for the life of James Solomon Russell. As shortly after he was ordained a priest in 1893, he was named as the archdeacon to the newly formed Diocese of Southern Virginia. Now, an archdeacon has different roles depending on where you are, but in this case, the archdeacon was someone who was in charge of training of deacons and sometimes even priests within the diocese. He was also a person who was equipped with kind of equivalent of what we have now known as the canon to the ordinary, a person who went around and assisted the bishop in supporting the congregations, encouraging them, preaching to them when necessary. For over 50 years, James Solomon Russell served as the archdeacon, and as such, one of his great ambitions was in bringing greater inclusivity to African Americans within the Diocese of Southern Virginia. As you can imagine, that part of Virginia with its plantations was home to a large number of African Americans who had been brought there during the days of slavery and who remained after slavery was finally abolished. And it was within that population, a couple of generations after the Civil War concluded, that he spent a lot of time going around and doing work while still tending to his administrative duties as the archdeacon. Oh, and during that time, he also helped to start what became known as St. Paul's College, what initially was known as St. Paul's Normal and Industrial School. St. Paul's College was one of the three African American affiliated Episcopal colleges that were formed in the United States in the latter half of the 19th century and early 20th century. It was a school that was designed particularly for African Americans, although there were occasionally a few white people that would attend later on in its history, but it was designed to give them normal training, which that was a word back then for what you would consider your basic liberal arts education or your basic bachelor's education, as we would say today, but also with an emphasis on industry, teaching a trade, teaching the African Americans in that area an actual skill that would allow them to achieve self-sufficiency and ultimately, hopefully, some level of equality with whites in the area. But also part of that school's curriculum, as very much was important to Russell, was to have a theological component, not so much training up priests, although he did establish an institute for that, with the bishop's assistance, but he also wanted his people in the college that he started to have a knowledge of the Bible and a knowledge of the church, and to be able to articulate a sense of their own faith that they could carry out into the world. And it worked, because it was through St. Paul's that many of the graduates became Episcopalians and began to attend Episcopal churches in Southern Virginia. Of course, early on, most of the churches were segregated, but ultimately you started to see some integration of the churches later on toward the end of Russell's life. Russell died, but he published his autobiography, which is something I would highly recommend to you to read, an autobiography called Adventure in Faith, which proclaims a good deal of his work that he did, but also an understanding of his vision for a church in which all people could come to know the power of God the Father working in them, as you heard from our passage from John, and understanding indeed that the great call of ministry for all of us as Christians, just as we heard with Charles Henry Brent yesterday in a much different way, and Richard Allen a few days ago, was to welcome all people into the fellowship of Christ, those who were far or near, and to be able to recognize that God's call to us is one church of all people, the diversity of nations and cultures gathered together, worshiping as one body, the great goodness and love of Jesus Christ being amongst us all. So we are grateful for the work of James Solomon Russell in helping to bring much needed diversity and welcoming in the truest and most sincere sense of the word to the Episcopal Church in Southern Virginia. Thanks for joining me. Look forward to seeing you for our next Saint of the Day tomorrow. Take care.